Hi everyone, welcome back. Welcome to the lecture for Chapter 2, which is about population and health. Here is a picture of a friend of mine and his family in Taipei, Taiwan, but they are a small, healthy, urban family in Taipei, Taiwan. They are a relatively affluent family. They're well fed, as you can see from all the delicious food on the table. They have a pretty small sized family. It is just my friend Ray and his brother. They've only had two children. They live in an urban area in a relatively small apartment. And so we're going to be looking at kind of some of the factors going forward of why some places have larger populations, why some have smaller, why some have larger family size, why some of them have smaller, and why some of them have better health outcomes than others. And so you might think, first of all, why are we talking about population and health together in the first place? They are very, very closely linked. Healthy places um, either grow slowly or begin to shrink, and we'll talk about why that is. Unhealthy places grow very quickly or shrink for very different reasons. And so here is a map of the Human Development Index. The Human Development Index is a metric that the UN uses. One is a perfect score. No country has one. But you can see lots of countries here with 0.85 and over, such as in Europe and the United States. It is basically a metric of a variety of things, including access to education, but also health and health outcomes. And so we can generally see, wealthier countries have better health outcomes, but they also have certain population characteristics, and these are linked with development. Generally speaking, more developed countries have better health outcomes and a slower growing or a not growing at all population. And again, we'll talk about why that is compared to places that are less developed. And so first we want to talk about where the world's people are distributed. Why is it that in some places, like this high rise in Hong Kong, you can imagine just how many people are living in that building, those buildings, versus in Patagonia in Argentina, very few people living there. We want to think about how many people are on this planet in the first place. On the world, we have about 7.5 billion people. In the United States, we have about 326 million. So a decent portion of that 7.5 billion, but certainly not the largest concentration of people. In California, we have about 39 million people out of that 326 in the United States. In San Diego County, we have 3.3 million people, which is a fair amount. But other places like Bangladesh has 160 million. Bangladesh is a really small country, but has lots and lots of people. Versus Mongolia, which is a fairly large country, they have less people than the city of Los Angeles does. Java, which is an island in Indonesia, has 145 million people on it, more than the entire country of Russia. So again, this population density is unevenly distributed throughout the planet. Here's a picture of people traveling home for the holidays in Bangladesh, right? Very, very densely populated. And so when we look at population, this is a cartogram that looks at your country size is basically based upon its population. And so, we can see places like India and China and Nigeria and Brazil have fairly large populations. And this is a map that floats around the internet constantly, where you see there are more people living inside of that circle than outside of it. Lots of people living in Asia. And why is that? So we have high populations where conditions encourage or encouraged large families in the past or the present. And we have high carrying capacity. And what I mean by carrying capacity is every environment can support a certain number of people. And so in these environments, lots of food there are lots of food and available resources. We have low populations in places that are very dry or very wet or too cold or too hot, or basically have these different extremes. and where agriculture is inhibited, they have a low carrying capacity. So you can imagine high in the mountains in Argentina, right? The weather is not very hospitable. You cannot grow as much food there. Same thing with a desert, right? Generally speaking, we don't have a lot of people living in a desert. That being said, developed countries are able to manipulate that quite a bit. Phoenix is living well beyond its carrying capacity, but that's because we're able to bring in many resources there. And so when we look at population density, it is kind of more useful to look at than total population. So map number 1 is our persons per square kilometer. You can see that, again, in Asia, right, but also in Europe is fairly dense. So this is an arithmetic measure of population density, so just the amount of people per square kilometer. There's the physiological, which is basically the amount of people per square kilometer of arable land, right? So that is, basically how much that difference between how much arable land you have or how much farmable land you have and how many people it can support. This is closer to capacity, right? So when we look at the map, number 2, when we look at persons per square kilometer of arable land, the world actually looks fairly more even, right? It's just that Asia has a lot more arable land than Europe does. And then we can also look at it agriculturally, which is farmers per square kilometer of arable land. And this indicates links to developed. Generally speaking, when you're in a developed country, you have less people farming. You've switched over to more of an industrial agricultural system. More people are going to live in a city. It's going to become more urban, which I'll talk about in a second. And so, generally speaking, you need less people to farm. In South and East Asia, still lots of people are farming. In Sub-Saharan Africa, lots of people are still farming. And so we can look at population density in California. We have 1 person for every 93 square kilometers, right? We have a lot of land in California that is fairly open. In San Diego County, that's higher. We have 260 people per square kilometer. In the city of San Diego, we've got about 4,000 people per square kilometer. So again, those urban areas are much more dense. In Hong Kong, though, in this one neighborhood in Hong Kong, you have 57,000 people per square kilometer. The city of San Diego is generally not that dense compared to some other really dense urban places in this world. So next we want to understand, why is population increasing? Right, when we look at kind of our population clock in 1950 we had 2.5 billion people. In 2015 we had nearly 7.5 billion people. Why is population exponentially increasing? And when is it going to stop? Right, and where is it increasing the most? It is not in places like the United States and Europe. So first we need to understand the natural increase rate, or the rate of natural increase. And this is births minus deaths as a percentage of the population. So the global average is 1.2% per year, which this will allow the global population to double in 54 years, which is not that long. And we can look, some places around the globe have much higher rates of natural increase. And generally speaking, these are poorer, less developed places, like in Sub-Saharan Africa, versus places that have almost no natural increase, places in Europe, and there are some places that are even starting to decrease in population. So the more developed are, the lower the rate of natural increase you have. So in the United States, we have a 0.54% rate of natural increase. It'll take 125 years as opposed to that 54 years for our population to double. In Germany, it's negative 0.28%. So again, below zero. And it is less in less developed countries, we have higher rates. So in Niger, which is where that star is on the map, that population is going to double every 19 years. We also want to understand the birth rate, which is again different from that natural rate of increase. Birth rate is live births per woman. Um, and so in the US, we have 1.9. So on average, women are having close to 2 children. Some families are much larger, some families are smaller, some people don't have kids at all. But on average, in the United States, we're having about 2 kids per woman, and that is going down. I have one child. I'm only going to have one child, and that is getting increasingly common as opposed to when I was a kid. It was much less common to just have one child. Again, if we look at Niger, on average, women there are having 6.6 live births. So again, higher in developing countries. If you're rural, you're generally going to have more kids because you need more children. They are more helpful in your situation. You also have less education for women, less access to contraception, a high infant mortality rate, and traditional societies where you have limited rights and roles for women and kind of emphasis placed upon large families. It's lower in developed countries. Um, we're more urban, our kids are costly. And it's the opposite of all of those above items. Generally speaking, women are going to school longer, they have more access to contraception, we have a lower infant mortality rate, and we have more kind of rights and roles for women. And then when we look at the death rate, this is higher in developing countries. We have things like less sanitation, more disease, less healthcare, less food, less stability, and more violence. um, Lower in developed countries for the opposite of all of those reasons, right? In the United States, we have a pretty good sanitation system. We have less disease, and we'll talk about different types of disease and how that changes um, when we get to the second half of this lecture. More access to healthcare, more food, less food insecurity, more politically stable, and less violence. It is higher in some developed places, the death rate, but that's just basically because there are a lot of old people. So in countries like Japan, you have a graying of the population. So you just have people who are living a lot longer, people having less and less children. So now you have this general graying of the population that has increased your death rate. And so we're going to, over the semester, look at different kind of population structures. And these are basically these little graphs that kind of show us the population makeup of an area. So they're population pyramid graphs, and they show the age and sex distributions of a population. And it shows dependency. And what I mean by dependency is if you look at a place like Naples, Florida, you have a lot of people, elderly people living in a place like Naples, Florida. That means you have a very high dependency ratio in that most of these people are retired and they are not working. So they are not contributing in the same way to the economy as younger people. So that dependency ratio is the ratio of children and or elderly to working age people. So in Laredo, Texas, it's the opposite. We have lots of children who are dependent upon working adults. And we can look at different population structures for lots of different places and why they are that way. And you can access them for just about any country on the CIA World Fact Book. If you Google that, you can go there and see it. So a place like Burkina Faso, which is relatively poor, not a lot of people living to old age. So you have this sharp decline in the age structure. So lots and lots of young people, less old people. You have a place like Turkey where now you have more people who are living longer, and so they are making it to adulthood. Right here, you have lots of children who are not making it to adulthood. Here, you have lots of children who are making it to adulthood. Places like Japan, where you have this bubble of elderly people, again, that higher dependency ratio. And then here's a unique population structure, right? A lot more men than women. And this happens in places like Qatar, where you have lots of people migrating who are coming in looking for work. Qatar is very wealthy, it has oil money, and so the average citizen is really not interested in construction. They are in the process of building stadiums for the World Cup, and so you have lots of men from other countries migrating in order to take that work. So we're going to talk about migration in the next chapter, in the next module, but that plays a big role into population structure as well. And next we're going to talk about the demographic transition model. You've probably heard about the demographic transition model at some point in high school. It's a pretty popular thing to teach, but it's basically this idea that demography or population structure changes with economies. And so we have these 4 stages. They are not perfect, they're kind of messy, but we can use them to just generally categorize countries in the world based upon where they are in this demographic transition. Countries are in various stages of this model. No countries are currently in stage 1. Stage 1 is where you have low growth, basically because you have very high death rates, very high birth rates. You're suffering from things like famine and disease at really high rates. So despite the fact that you're having lots of children, there is no population growth. Stage 2, we're going to go back to Niger. This happens in our least developed countries, some of our poorest countries. We have a really high birth rate and a really high death rate, but those death rates are declining as we get access to better medicine. So again, we have this high dependency ratio, lots of really young people dependent on, this is Afghanistan, this is children in Niger, but the population structure is similar. Many more births, high youth dependency. So in Afghanistan, 41% of the population is under 14. So this is stage 2, and again, this is the least developed countries in the world. Stage 3, you have decreasing growth. So these are medium developing countries. They are industrializing. In that process, they are becoming more urban. Examples of this are Chile, Mexico, Thailand, China, Malaysia. Birth rates are starting to fall, right? You have women in the workforce who are having less children, and death rates are continuing to fall. You have low dependency, generally speaking, because right now, if you look here at Thailand, lots of people who are able to work, right? So in Thailand, as opposed to in Afghanistan, you only have a 40% dependency as opposed to an 89% dependency rate. And lots of difficult social changes here, in that you are kind of switching from larger families to smaller families, switching from women in more traditional roles to women in the workplace. Then we have stage 4, which is where you have very low growth. And this happens in developed countries that are really heavily urbanized, like the United States. Birth rates keep falling. Women are having less children for those reasons described before. Birth rates rise slightly, but this is mostly due to having more elderly people in your population, right? Many old people. So here you have Belgium, you have that population kind of bubble. Now it is higher. And so basically what this is doing is approaching zero natural growth, where your population is not growing at all. It may, however, excuse me, grow by migration, which we'll talk about in the next chapter. You have a rising dependency again, but not because you have a lot of young people. Now you have a lot of people who have reached old age. Right, so Belgium, now that dependency ratio has gone up. Now it's 54.2%. And generally speaking, as places get more developed, they become more urbanized. Urbanization is the percentage of the country's population living in cities or urbanized areas. If you live most anywhere in San Diego County, you're living in an urban area, right? You are in a metropolitan area. This rises with that demographic transition. So as you go through the stages of the demographic transition model, places become more and more urban. Right, so you look at Swaziland up there, 21.3% urban, compared to New Zealand, where nearly 90% of the people are living in an urban area. So Niger, which is in stage 2, 19.3% urban. China, which is in stage 3, getting increasingly more urban, 57.9% urban. Belgium, which is in stage 4, almost 98% urban. And these real transitions are messy, right? So we can map these through poorer countries like the Gambia or through a stage 3 country like Mexico, and you could see dips and rises versus Denmark. Different things can happen. You can imagine how war or food shortages or migration events can affect these transitions. And so I'm going to break there and we will come back and talk about why some places face health threats, why other places face less of them.